There is a watchmaker's shop on the Quai de l'Horloge in Paris that has never really closed. It has survived revolution, exile, theft, 2 world wars, and the complete transformation of what it means to tell time. The man who built it died more than 200 years ago. And yet every watch that leaves that address is still, in some fundamental way, his. His name was Abraham Louis Breguet. He was born in a small Swiss principality that most people have never heard of, to a merchant family that would not survive his childhood intact. He would lose his father at 11, leave home at 15 with nothing but his hands and his curiosity, and end up building the most technically advanced watches the world had ever seen, for queens, for emperors, for kings across 3 countries. He would be chased out of Paris by revolutionaries who wanted to put his head on a spike. And then, impossibly, he would come back. This is not just a story about watches. It is a story about what happens when a brilliant mind refuses to accept the limits that the world sets for it. It is a story about a boy who grew up in the mountains and ended up changing the way every human being on Earth measures their day. On January 10, 1747, Abraham Louis Breguet came into the world in Neuchâtel, a principality tucked into the western edge of what is now Switzerland, then technically under Prussian sovereignty, a place where Calvinist discipline shaped every hour of every day. His parents were modest people. His father, Jonas Louis, was a merchant, a man trying to make a living in a town that was not especially prosperous. His mother, Suzanne Marguerite, came from a family of French Protestant descent, Huguenot blood running through her from generations of people who had learned to survive in difficult circumstances. The family was not poor in the sense of hunger and desperation, but they were not wealthy either. Neuchâtel in the mid-1700s was a town of perhaps 5,000 souls, ringed by the Jura Mountains, swept by lake winds off the shores of the very lake that bears its name. It was a serious place, a watchful place. The people who lived there understood that survival required discipline, that comfort had to be earned through careful work, and that the world did not reward dreaming. Young Abraham Louis grew up absorbing all of that, the rhythms of a modest household, the cold winters, the Protestant ethic that said, you were what you produced and nothing more. And then, in 1758, when Abraham Louis was 11 years old, his father died. That is the moment the story really begins, though no one knew it at the time. An 11-year-old boy in 18th century Switzerland, left without a father, suddenly had to understand that the comfortable ground beneath him was not solid at all. The merchant trade Jonas Louis had built, modest as it was, died with him. Suzanne Marguerite was left with her son, a household, and a future that had to be rebuilt from the ground up. His mother remarried. This part of the story might have gone badly. Remarriages in that era so often did, but it did not. She married a man named Joseph Tatet, who happened to come from a family with deep roots in the watchmaking trade, with connections that stretched all the way to Paris. And something shifted. The boy who had lost his father found himself living inside a household where watches keys were discussed, where mechanisms were taken apart and reassembled on the kitchen table, where precision was not just admired, but practiced. Tatet would speak of movement architecture the way a carpenter speaks of joinery, not with reverence, but with intimacy. To him, it was craft. To the boy watching from across the room, it was revelation. Abraham Louis would have sat at that table for hours if they had let him. They let him. It is worth pausing here to understand what watchmaking meant in 1760. The watch was the most sophisticated manufactured object in the world. Nothing else required the same combination of metallurgy, mathematics, engineering, and aesthetics. A master watchmaker was considered, in the language of the time, the only craftsman capable of reproducing and miniaturizing the universe itself, capturing the movement of celestial bodies in a brass case small enough to fit in a waistcoat pocket. For a boy with a hunger to understand how things worked, there could not have been a more intoxicating world to stumble into. At 14, Abraham Louis left school, not because he had failed, quite the opposite. He had absorbed everything the local schools could offer and was restless for something more. He began an apprenticeship with a local watchmaker in Les Verrières, a small town not far from Neuchâtel. Within a year, it was clear that the apprenticeship had run its course, not because he had finished it in the traditional sense, but because the master had nothing left to teach him. What do you do when your student surpasses you before he has even shaved? You send him to Paris. In 1762, at the age of 15, Abraham Louis Breguet arrived in Versailles, not Paris itself, but the glittering royal suburb where France kept its court and where the finest craftsmen in the country competed for aristocratic patronage. He was apprenticed to a watchmaker there, and what happened next became one of those stories that gets repeated because it is almost too perfect to be true. The young Breguet astonished his new master, not after months, not after years. Almost immediately, the boy from Neuchâtel was demonstrating a grasp of mechanical principles that his employer had spent decades acquiring. But here is where Breguet did something that separated him from the merely talented. He did not rest on his natural gifts. He went to school at night. At the Collège Mazarin, he took evening classes in mathematics under a priest named Abbé Marie, a man who would become one of the most important figures in his life. Marie recognized what he had in front of him. He tutored the Dukes of Angoulême and de Berry, men who would grow up to be fixtures of the French court. And at some point, he brought his brilliant watchmaking student to the attention of the king himself. King Louis XVI was fascinated by mechanics. This was a genuine enthusiasm, not a polite royal gesture. The king had his own locksmithing workshop and spent considerable hours working with his hands. When Abbé Marie arranged for Breguet to be introduced to the monarch, it was not a fleeting audience. Louis became a patron. And in 18th century France, royal patronage was not merely an honor. It was a financial lifeline, a marketing platform, and a social passport all at once. In 1775, Abraham Louis Breguet married Cécile Marie-Louise L'Huillier and established his watchmaking workshop at 51 Quai de l'Horloge on the Ile de la Cité in Paris. The address was not chosen at random. That stretch of the Seine embankment was where the finest horologists in France had clustered: Ferdinand Berthoud, Jean-Antoine Lepine, the men who had been Breguet's teachers and who were now, quietly, his competitors. He had studied under them. He had absorbed their methods and their secrets. And now he was setting up a workshop a few blocks away, preparing to do something neither of them had managed. He would not just make excellent watches. He would reinvent what a watch could be. The early years of the Breguet workshop were years of quiet revolution. While his neighbors continued to refine the existing conventions of watchmaking, Breguet kept pushing through the wall of what was considered possible. In 1780, he produced what he called the Perpetuelle, the world's first genuinely successful self-winding watch. The idea was not entirely new. A few watchmakers had experimented with motion-powered winding before, but none of them had solved it in a way that actually worked reliably in everyday wear. Breguet's solution used a platinum oscillating weight, platinum because its density meant even small movements generated meaningful winding force, and the mechanism was so elegantly engineered that it became the conceptual grandfather of every automatic watch made since. When you look at the rotor spinning inside a modern mechanical watch, you are looking at the direct descendant of what Breguet invented in a workshop on the Seine in 1780. The parachute shock protection system followed, then improved repeater mechanisms, then a guilloche engraving technique for watch dials that gave them a delicate, textured beauty that remains unmistakable to this day. Each invention was not a standalone curiosity. It was a solution to a real problem, designed with the obsessive rigor of a man who could not tolerate imprecision. By the mid-1780s, the workshop on the Quai de l'Horloge had become something more than a watch shop. It had become a destination. Word had spread through the salons and drawing rooms of Paris with the particular velocity that reputation travels in a city where social standing depends on knowing things before other people do. Aristocrats passed his name from one household to the next, not as a simple recommendation, but as something closer to an initiation, something you shared only with people who could appreciate it. Visitors to Paris, diplomats, foreign royalty, scholars who had heard about this extraordinary Swiss craftsman made a point of stopping in. The shop became a place where you could find a cardinal in quiet conversation with a cavalry general, both of them waiting for a piece that would not be ready for 6 more months and perfectly content with that arrangement. Breguet was accepted into the guild as a master watchmaker in 1784 and became a purveyor of watches to the French king in 1785. The boy from Neuchâtel had arrived. Then came the watch that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In 1783, a mysterious commission arrived at the workshop. The identity of the person who placed the order has never been confirmed. Some historians believe it was a Swedish count named Axel von Fersen, who was widely understood to be the intimate companion of Queen Marie Antoinette. Others believe the commission came directly from a devoted admirer within the Queen's circle. What is certain is the instruction that accompanied the order: create a watch for the Queen, make it the most complicated watch ever built, use every known horological complication, and wherever gold can replace any other metal, use gold. Cost is not a factor. Time is not a factor. Breguet accepted. The scope of what was being asked was staggering even by his standards. Watch number 160 would need to incorporate a perpetual calendar, a mechanism that automatically accounts for months of different lengths and leap years without needing to be adjusted. It would need a minute repeater, chiming the hours and minutes on demand. It would need an equation of time display, showing the difference between solar time and clock time. It would need a thermometer, a power reserve indicator. All of this housed in a case that could still be carried in a pocket, all of it engineered to a standard of precision that would embarrass the finest watchmakers in Europe. The price was never formally stated. The understanding was simply that the bill would be presented when the work was complete, and that the work would not be hurried. It would take decades to finish. Marie Antoinette herself would never see it. But the commission became a kind of North Star for Breguet's workshop, a proof of concept for everything the atelier could do when freed from ordinary constraints. The watch would eventually incorporate 10 major complications in a case the size of a large pocket watch. It is still considered one of the most complicated pocket watches ever made, but the Queen who had inspired it was about to lose her head. The French Revolution broke over Paris like a storm that no one had quite believed was coming. In 1789, the world that had sustained Abraham Louis Breguet, the world of royal commissions, aristocratic patronage, and gilded workshops serving the privileged few, began to collapse with terrifying speed. The Bastille fell. The king was arrested. The aristocracy fled or was guillotined. The very customers who had kept the Quai de l'Horloge alive were either in exile or in the tumbrils. Breguet walked a careful line in the early years of the revolution. He was not an aristocrat. He was a craftsman, a bourgeois professional, a man who had built his position through skill rather than birth. In theory, that should have protected him. In practice, the revolution did not draw careful distinctions. Anyone connected to the royal court, anyone who had taken commissions from the nobility, anyone who smelled of the old regime, was at risk. By 1793, Paris had become a city of whispers and suspicion. Neighbors reported neighbors. Lists circulated through the Committee of Public Safety with names that meant arrest, and arrest most often meant the guillotine. The workshops on the Quai de l'Horloge, once a street of elegant commerce and aristocratic patronage, now sat in a part of the city where revolutionary committees watched who came and went. Breguet had watched his clientele disappear over the preceding years. Some had fled to London or Vienna. Some had been executed. The unfinished watches sitting in his workshop were objects of dangerous memory, each one a testament to a world that the revolution had declared criminal. The Marie Antoinette Commission alone, with its explicit instructions to use gold wherever possible, and its association with a woman who had become a symbol of royal excess, was the kind of thing that could get a man killed simply for possessing it. The danger arrived with a knock on the door. Breguet had, years earlier, done something remarkable. He had saved a man's life. It happened this way. Jean-Paul Marat, the radical journalist who would become one of the most feared figures of the Terror, had once been caught in a dangerous situation when a crowd of enemies gathered outside a friend's apartment, where both men happened to be present. The crowd was chanting death threats. Breguet had acted quickly. He dressed Marat in the clothes of an old woman, and the two of them slipped away through the mob. It was a detail that would prove decisive. In 1793, Marat discovered that Breguet's name had appeared on a list maintained by the revolutionary committees of those who were to be arrested and brought to the guillotine. In return for the debt he owed, Marat arranged for a safe conduct pass. Breguet escaped to Switzerland. He left behind his workshop, his tools, his archive of commissions, his unfinished masterwork for the Queen. He left behind everything he had built in 20 years. He was 46 years old. Breguet spent time in Switzerland during the exile, moving between cities. He eventually settled for a period in Le Locle and Neuchâtel, towns in the Swiss Jura that sat at the heart of one of the great centers of watchmaking in the world. He was not idle. He maintained an active correspondence with former clients and colleagues, writing careful letters about mechanisms he was theorizing, about complications he had not yet had the resources to build. He was a man thinking at full capacity while waiting for the world to reassemble itself. The exile that could have broken him was, instead, a period of intense intellectual fermentation. He wrote to former colleagues in Paris about the state of the Quai de l'Horloge, about whether his workshop tools had survived the Revolutionary Committee's attention, about the mechanisms he was imagining in the quiet of his Swiss rooms. He wrote to watchmaking friends in the Jura with technical questions about the behavior of specific alloys under temperature changes, about the geometry of particular spring configurations. He was not resting. He was designing, on paper, in his head, in letters that crisscrossed the mountains between Switzerland and France, a watch that did not yet exist. And the problem that had occupied him most deeply, one he had been circling for years, began to crystallize into something he could actually build. In 1795, when the worst of the revolutionary violence had subsided and the political climate in France had stabilized, Breguet came back to Paris. He was 48 years old, starting over in a city that had transformed itself beyond recognition, with a workshop that had been shuttered for 2 years. Most people would have seen this as the end of the story. Breguet saw it as the beginning. But those first years back were not without their trials. While Breguet had been in exile, something troubling had happened to his reputation, or rather, to the commercial exploitation of it. Counterfeit Breguet watches had begun appearing in the Paris markets. These were not crude fakes that any knowledgeable buyer would dismiss at a glance. Some were sophisticated enough to fool experienced collectors. They bore his name on the dial, his characteristic hands, his guilloche decoration, everything that made a Breguet except the mind that had designed the mechanism and the hands that had assembled it. Breguet was furious. The forgeries not only cost him sales, they threatened the one thing he had spent his entire career building, his reputation for absolute, uncompromising precision. He responded in the most Breguet way imaginable. He devised a secret signature, etched in microscopic text, visible only through a loop on a specific hidden part of each dial, a private authentication mark that the forgers could not replicate because they did not know where to look or how it was made. It was a watchmaker's answer to a watchmaker's problem, elegant, invisible, and ruthlessly effective. The idea he had been developing through the exile years was something he called the tourbillon. The word tourbillon is French for whirlwind. The problem it solved was this: a pocket watch spends most of its life in a vertical position, in a waistcoat pocket, hanging on a chain. Gravity, acting on the balance wheel and escapement in this vertical orientation, creates subtle but cumulative errors in timekeeping. Think of it this way: a watch is essentially a controlled oscillation, a balance wheel swinging back and forth at a precise frequency, counting out the seconds. But when that balance wheel sits in a vertical plane, gravity pulls slightly unevenly on different parts of the wheel at different points in its swing. The effect is tiny in any single oscillation, but multiply that tiny effect by the thousands of oscillations a balance wheel makes every hour, and the accumulated error becomes real and measurable. A fine watch might gain or lose a minute a day, purely because of the position in which it was worn. Watchmakers had been wrestling with this problem for as long as pocket watches had existed. Their solutions were partial, inelegant, or impractical. Breguet's solution was to put the entire escapement, the balance wheel, the pallet fork, the escape wheel, into a small rotating cage that completed one full rotation every 60 seconds. By continuously rotating the escapement through all vertical positions, the tourbillon averaged out the gravitational errors that accumulated in any single position. No position had time to build up an error, because the cage never stayed still long enough. The errors cancelled each other out before they could compound. It did not just reduce the problem, it attacked the problem at its root. On December 24, 1800, Breguet submitted the complete technical file for the tourbillon to the French Patent Office, accompanied by a watercolor drawing of exquisite precision. On June 26, 1801, the patent was granted. The tourbillon would become the most celebrated complication in the history of watchmaking, not merely for what it accomplished mechanically, but for what it represented aesthetically: a tiny, mesmerizing cage spinning inside a watch movement, a visible demonstration that the person wearing the watch owned something that had been designed with a level of care and ingenuity that bordered on the obsessive. Today, a tourbillon serves more as a symbol than as a strict necessity. Modern materials and manufacturing have reduced positional errors in other ways, but that does not diminish what Breguet achieved in 1801. He solved, with pure mechanical genius, a problem that the entire watchmaking world had accepted as simply the nature of things. He refused to accept it. That refusal, more than any single gear or spring, is the essence of what Breguet was. He did not stop there. His mind, once it had solved a problem, immediately moved to the next one. He developed a new type of escapement, the natural escapement, that reduced friction and improved accuracy. He invented the Breguet overcoil, a modification to the shape of the hairspring that improved its concentric breathing and made the watch more consistent across temperature variations. These were not vanity projects. They were the work of a man who genuinely could not leave a problem unsolved. The clients came back, not just the old ones. A different, newer, more energetic class of patron was now clustering around the workshop on the Quai de l'Horloge. Napoleon Bonaparte, the diminutive artillery officer who had ridden the revolution's chaotic aftermath to become the most powerful man in Europe, became one of Breguet's most devoted customers. So did his sister, his marshals, his court. The Tsar of Russia ordered watches. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire ordered watches. The Prince of Wales, who would eventually become King George IV of England, became such an enthusiastic patron that Breguet spent time in London working directly with the British royal household. This is the moment worth sitting with. A man who had been chased out of Paris with a death warrant, who had spent 2 years in exile, who had returned to a city transformed by revolution and blood. This man was now selling to the rulers of 3 different empires simultaneously. It is one of the most extraordinary comebacks in the history of any craft. And through all of it, watch number 160 waited. Breguet continued working on the Queen's commission through the years of exile and the years of recovery. The complications accumulated slowly, carefully, one by one. It is a haunting image, a watch being built for a woman who had been dead for years, by a man who understood that the commission had become something larger than its original purpose. It was a testament to what the human mind could achieve when given enough time and enough ambition. When Breguet died in September 1823, at the age of 76, the watch was still not quite finished. His son, Antoine Louis, completed it in 1827, 4 years after his father's death. Watch number 160 would go on to have adventures of its own. It was stolen from a museum in Jerusalem in 1983 in one of the most audacious watch heists in history. It was recovered quietly 2 decades later and is now displayed at the LA Mayer Museum for Islamic Art in Jerusalem, one of the most visited objects in the building. It has outlasted everyone. The question of what Abraham Louis Breguet actually invented is worth examining with some care, because the list is almost implausibly long. The self-winding watch, the tourbillon, the Breguet overcoil, the shock protection system known as the parachute, the guilloche dial technique that gave his watches their distinctive visual signature, a new type of repeater spring, the equation of time display. The world's first wristwatch, created in 1810 for Caroline Murat, Queen of Naples, a timepiece commissioned specifically to be worn on the wrist rather than carried in a pocket, a decade before anyone else had conceived of such a thing. Each of these inventions is not simply a historical curiosity. Each one lives on. The automatic watch in your drawer, the shock protection in any quality watch made today, the hairspring geometry that governs accuracy in every fine mechanical timepiece. All of these trace directly back to a workshop on the Quai de l'Horloge in Paris, to the hands and the mind of a man who arrived in the city at 15 with nothing but his apprenticeship papers and an appetite for problems that no one had solved yet. His competitors understood what they were dealing with. Ferdinand Berthoud and Jean-Antoine Lepine, the men who had been his teachers and then his neighbors on the Place Dauphine, watched the younger man build something that neither of them had been able to imagine. They were both excellent watchmakers. Berthoud was the official watchmaker to the King of France and the French Navy. Lepine had invented a new watch movement architecture that made pocket watches significantly thinner. These were not ordinary craftsmen, and yet they could see, by the 1780s, that Breguet was operating in a different register entirely. that he was not merely making better watches, but was fundamentally reimagining what a watch was. There is a word that gets used about a small number of people in any field across any century. The word is revolutionary. It gets used too loosely, applied to anyone who does something slightly different, slightly better, slightly new. But there are moments in history when a single person genuinely changes the direction of a craft. And when you look at the history of watchmaking before Breguet and after Breguet, the transformation is so complete that the word is simply accurate. After his death in September 1823, the workshop on the Quai de l'Horloge continued under his son, and then passed through various hands across the 19th and 20th centuries. There were difficult periods. There were prosperous periods. There was a heist in 1983 that removed one of the most famous objects the brand had ever produced. There was a period of ownership by a Bahraini investment group called Investcorp, under whose stewardship the brand grew tenfold in commercial terms. In 1999, the Swatch Group, the Swiss conglomerate that had already saved the Swiss watch industry once, in the 1980s, when the rise of Japanese quartz watches had nearly destroyed it, acquired Breguet. Nicholas Hayek, the founder of the Swatch Group and one of the shrewdest minds in the watch industry, considered it the crown jewel of his portfolio. He established the Breguet Museum, which opened in Paris in 2000, and filled it with the original drawings, the archive of order books, the historical pieces that documented what had been achieved in that workshop since 1775. Today, Breguet watches sell for prices that would have astonished even the aristocrats who originally commissioned them. The simplest models start at tens of thousands of dollars. Tourbillons made now by hand in the Swiss Jura, where Breguet spent his exile 230 years ago, can reach hundreds of thousands. There is a waiting list. There has always been a waiting list. But here is what matters most. When you hold a Breguet watch, and very few people get the chance, but when you do, you are holding something that was thought through at a level of intensity and care that is almost impossible to articulate. The guilloche dial, machined on manually operated Rose engines, produces a pattern that changes with the angle of the light, like something alive. The Breguet hands, with their distinctive hollow circles at the tip, point to Roman numerals with a quiet authority that somehow manages to be both archaic and perfectly modern at the same time. The movement visible through the case back is a landscape of tiny bridges and wheels and springs, all moving with a regularity that makes you want to believe that precision is possible, that the world can be understood, that a boy from Neuchâtel with a dead father and a stepfather who knew people in Paris can end up making something that outlasts everyone. The Swiss Jura mountains that Abraham Louis Breguet grew up looking at are still there. The watchmakers are still there too, working in the same valley, in many cases the direct descendants of the craftsmen who made parts for Breguet's original workshop in the 1780s. There is a continuity in this industry that is unlike almost anything else in manufacturing, an unbroken chain of knowledge and practice running from the 18th century to the 21st, passed from hand to hand, from master to apprentice, across 250 years. Breguet did not just make watches. He made it possible for the people who came after him to make better watches by giving them a foundation so solid that it has never needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Every automatic watch ever made builds on his perpetuel. Every shock protection system traces back to his parachute. Every tourbillon, and there are hundreds of watchmakers making them now in Switzerland, in Germany, in China, in Japan, is built on the patent he filed on Christmas Eve of 1800, a few years after he came back from exile with nothing but his ideas. The boy from Neuchâtel, the son of a merchant who did not live long enough to see what his child would become. The watchmaker who dressed a revolutionary in women's clothes and slipped through a Paris mob, the man who built a timepiece for a queen and lived to see the queen executed and the watch still unfinished. That man did not just survive, he built something that time itself has not been able to destroy. And in a craft dedicated entirely to the measurement of passing moments, there is no greater legacy than that.